Well, let's speak now to Mohammed Mansour, who is the Senior Nutrition Manager in the occupied Palestinian territory for the International Rescue Committee. He joins us now from Gaza City. Mr. Mansour, thank you very much indeed for joining us today. I'd just like to start by asking you, since you're in Gaza, just tell us what's going on around you.
Yes, the situation now at Gaza, all the people here are suffering, especially in terms of lacking of the basic services, including no shelters, no clean water, no food, also no fuel. So people here at Gaza, they are struggling in daily basis to survive. This is the exact situation at Gaza now.
Okay, and we're being told that children and families right across Gaza are starving in some cases. They urgently need food, as you've been saying, water supplies, medical supplies. Just tell us a bit about your activity. Tell us what the IRC is doing there.
Yes, as I mentioned, that people now are struggling to get the basic services. Yeah, that the reports indicated that they are skyrocketing of the rate of malnutrition in Gaza. The latest IBC report indicated that the entire population are facing high levels of food insecurity. In addition, that the health system are truly collapsed. In addition, the people here suffering from many diseases and outbreaks of infection. So in spite of this volatile situation, the IRC has been able to provide crucial and life-saving services. These services include nutrition screening and management, in addition to delivering some nutrition commodities to the most vulnerable groups, including children, pregnant, lactating women. In addition to provide water tracking and hygiene promotion sessions, in addition to hygiene kits also to the households of children who are suffering from diseases and malnutrition. Moreover, there is also services related to child protection. These services targeted the separated and unaccompanied children, in addition to provide case management services and protection women and girls from the gender-based violence. Also, there are activities from IRC for the cash assistance to the most vulnerable group. Also, IRC is supporting the local partners, local non-governmental organization to some extent to minimize the impact of this war on the health system. As you know, since the October of 2023, the health system have been devastated, leaving most of hospitals are non-functional. You cannot imagine that just only 19 out of 36 of the hospitals, either private or public, now are partial function. This lead to the increase of the mortality rate among the injured people. Even treatable illnesses or injured now become life-threatening, especially in the presence of or the lack of the medical supplies or the essential medication. This is the situation exactly in Gaza, and this is what IRC is providing.
Mr. Mansour, you paint an extremely bleak picture of the situation there. Some aid agencies are now talking about famine or the risk of famine. Famine comes with a specific definition. Is that the point that Gaza is now at? Is there a famine?
Yes, as I mentioned, based on the latest IBC report, which indicated that or half a million of people now facing a famine and a starvation, and the entire population facing food crisis and suffering of high levels of food insecurity. You cannot imagine the markets are empty. Even the available food items, the prices are soaring in daily basis. Also, there is a big problem in terms of lack of cash liquidity. This also worsen the situation. I can also add that the shortage of nutrition commodities and the shortage of the humanitarian aids also worsen that situation. Let me give you an example that the 1 kilo of flour at Gaza now costs more than $20. The people here cannot afford this. So people still suffering, people struggle here just to survive, not to live.
Tell us an example of someone you've spoken to recently. I expect you're speaking to families, to children. Just tell us an example of the ordeal that some of those people are going through.
And one of the example can I highlight that children that way face them at the field during our implementing our nutrition activities, that there is an increase of outbreaks of infection, especially acute diarrheal infection. And when we talked with the mother of the child, she confirmed that they have no food, no even clean water to replenish this child. Also, there is no source of income. So also the people here suffering in terms of the lacking of everything. More than 90% of people now forced to displace from their original. Now they are staying at tents and also over the ruins of their destroyed building. This worsen the situation and also increase the incidence and the prevalence of diseases among those children.
Mr. Mansour, there are some people in the Israeli government, in Israel and in other countries who deny what you're saying, who say a lot of the reports about starvation, about inadequate supplies are enormously exaggerated. What would be your message to someone who claimed that these kinds of report are an exaggeration or worse still, fake news?
Yes, to be honest, that since the 1st of March, there is no AIDS has entered Gaza. And also all nutrition commodities and foods run out in this warehouses of the international and national warehouses. So people cannot obtain the basic food to grow. People now suffering from starvation, people now suffering of increasing the incidence and the prevalence of the life-threatening diseases, especially among pregnant, lactating women and children. So the intensified blockade and the continuity of this conflict, I think, will worsen and worsen the situation more and more. And we can notice that more people will die due to the starvation and the shortage of food.
Are we at the stage where 100% of the population of Gaza is depending on aid?
Yes, now 100% of the people depend totally on the aid, because there is no source of income. There is increase of the unemployment rate. So almost 100 of people now rely completely on the humanitarian aids.
Have you ever seen anything that can be compared to the situation there in Gaza, or is this the worst you've ever seen?
Yes, I think from my experience and working through the humanitarian organization, what is happening now in Gaza, it is not just humanitarian crisis. It is a catastrophe. So people now suffering. The Gaza's context is different from other contexts in the world. If we want to compare Gaza's context, for example, to some, for example, Yemen, Somalia, Sudan, okay, I think Gaza's context is the worst one.
Okay, and just tell us a little about, how even if the fighting stopped tomorrow, that wouldn't be the end of the crisis, would it? There would be a long period of catch-up before food got to those who needed it, before life returned to normal. How long would it take for some semblance of normality from a nutrition point of view return to Gaza if the fighting stopped tomorrow?
I think we need months, also maybe years to return to the normal nutrition status of those children and people at Gaza, because we are talking about more than 1.5 years of starvation and of suffering. Now we not just talk about acute malnutrition. Also, we talk about chronic malnutrition, including stunting, including micronutrient deficiency, for example, anemia, rickets, especially among children.
And what's your message in this context to the international community? What would you like to happen? What needs to happen to prevent the further loss of life in Gaza?
First of all, to stop hostilities, to stop this war, to stop this conflict. In addition, to ensure unrestricted humanitarian aids. Also, we want also to increase the fundraising to Gaza to meet the overwhelmed and the increase of demands of the population here. Also, we want to rebuild the infrastructure. You cannot imagine that also all the infrastructure have been distracted, including the water system, garbage and waste system. This this is what we need now, because Gaza's people deserve to live. Gaza's people deserve to live in dignity and peace and safety.
And what's your message to Israel? What would you like Israel to do?
And my message to Israel, okay, I think this is enough. You destroyed everything. You have to stop this one, so then we can save the remaining souls of the children that we have. Stop war, stop conflict, stop violence.
And just lastly, tell us what word you'd use to describe the mood in Gaza. What do you think is the most accurate word or words to describe the mood right now in Gaza?
As I said, what is happening now at Gaza, it is not a humanitarian crisis. It is a crisis of humanity. It is a catastrophe. There are lacking of everything. Gaza now, okay, it is not a place for living or survival.
Okay, well, we really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us, and we wish you and your colleagues at the IRC all the very best. Thank you very much indeed, Mohammed Mansour. Thank you.
Thank you. You are welcome.
Well, let's bring into the conversation Fleur Hassan-Nahoum, who is the Israeli Foreign Ministry's special envoy and former deputy mayor of Jerusalem, who joins us from Jerusalem. Thank you so much for being with us once again here on Arabic English. We've just been speaking to a senior representative from the International Rescue Committee who joined us from Gaza City, where he described a catastrophic level of hunger. He said there's 100% dependency on aid amongst Gaza's population. He described it nothing short of a catastrophe. I mean, what's your reaction when you see the pictures that we've all been seeing in the world news of starving men, women and children there in Gaza?
Well, firstly, it's a very tragic situation, but we have to understand why this is happening. The reason why there are starving people, if in fact the numbers are what they're claimed to be, is simply because Hamas steal the aid. Now, you could argue as to whether they steal 50% of it or 70% of it or 90% of it, but there's plenty of evidence to tell us all that Hamas is stealing the aid, that they've been stealing the aid for a year and a half, and that somehow they still have enough food to take down into their tunnels and to keep fighting. Somehow that food doesn't get to the hostages who come out looking completely emaciated like Holocaust survivors. And so the problem that Israel's been trying to solve, the dilemma that Israel has is that all the aid that's been going in, and it's been over 1 million tons of aid since the beginning of the war that, as you know, we didn't start. The question is, if this aid is being used by Hamas in order to keep funding their terrorist activities, in order to keep funding, paying for their soldiers, then all Israel is doing is perpetuating the war against us and the misery of the Gazans. And this is why the Americans are trying to help us find an alternative solution so that the aid goes into the hands of the innocent people and not into the hands of the terrorists.
Right, we've just been looking at some of the pictures of how that's been working out, and it's a scene of total desperation and chaos. And as you say, it's tragic. But your logic, help us understand this. You're saying that Hamas is stealing the food, so let's blockade Gaza for 11 weeks so that no food whatsoever gets in. I mean, they'll have nothing to steal, but then children will have nothing to eat, will they?
Well, it's not so clear, because when we had the ceasefire for over a month, aid flooded in that should have lasted the Gaza Strip till July. That's what the expert says. But what happens? Hamas not just stole the aid, they started selling it to the innocent people for a premium, because that's how they fund their terrorist network, their terrorist activities. And so the question is Israel, who was the invaded party on October 7th, supposed to now continue to feed terrorists who are stealing food from their own children? This is a moral dilemma. It's also a military dilemma. What does Israel do? And what I'm saying is that we may see scenes of chaos, but at least the Americans are trying to help us find a solution.
We'll talk about that solution, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, in just a moment, because there's lots to talk about there. But I just want to ask you about, how Israel feels internationally at this particular moment, because the chorus of condemnation is pretty unprecedented. At the start of the week, just to give you an example, there were 800 British-based legal experts, amongst them former Supreme Court judges. They wrote to the British Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer. They said genocide is being perpetuated in Gaza. Those are very strong words. What's your response?
It's absolutely ridiculous. For genocide, you need intention. For genocide, you need to want to wipe out an entire population. If Israel is committing genocide or had the intention to commit genocide, why did we vaccinate hundreds and thousands of Gazan children with polio? Does that sound like a country that wants to commit genocide onto another people? It's absolutely ridiculous.
But why give them vaccinations if we're looking at...
Even in humanitarian law, there are solutions, and also there are precedents for sieges when it means that the military establishment, or the terrorist establishment in this case of that place, will end. The Allies did it when they were fighting the war against ISIS. They did it in Mosul, and nobody had all these condemnations. So the question is, why is there such double standards when it comes to Israel fighting a war that it didn't start, and when it comes to Israel fighting an existential enemy that we need to get rid of in order to restore the safety of our country?
Yeah, but Israel's had 600 days to do that, and you have an advanced army.
Yes, and we've also had 600, and Hamas has had 600 days to release the hostages that are still there. Why are they still keeping the hostages? If they want an end to this, why don't they just return the hostages?
Well, if doesn't Israel want to hold the moral high ground here?
Israel wants our people home and the existential threats from a jihadi Islamist terror group on our border that attacked our people completely unprovoked on October 7th, killing women and children and taking 250 hostages, including babies. We want them gone. And I think that at this point, the Gazan people also want them gone. And let me tell you what the news doesn't show you, and that is the dozens of people that Hamas shoot in the head, point blank, every day for protesting their terrible, poisonous, destructive leadership.
Yeah, I mean, I don't dispute that Gaza, that Hamas has been guilty of some atrocities, but we're also looking at pictures, well, atrocities full stop. We've been looking at pictures of emaciated children, emaciated because they've got nothing to eat. And you can't say that a full blockade... The reason why they have nothing to eat is because their own authority is stealing the food from those people. Well, no, it's just not coming across the border. It was a blockade for 11 weeks.
To talk about double standards, you can also say that there's millions of emaciated people in Sudan. The news never covers that. Yemen has also used starvation as a weapon of war. We're not doing that. We're letting everything in, but Hamas is stealing the aid. There was enough aid that went in that was supposed to last till July, but Hamas took it in order to continue to fund the war. So this is what I'm saying. Israel finds itself in a dilemma because we are a law-abiding country, because we do abide by humanitarian law, and because we have no intention of seeing innocent people die. However, we're facing an enemy that uses their own people as a weapon of a war against us. And that is a dilemma that we find ourselves in.
It's not just those British judges that I mentioned at the beginning. Italy, a longtime ally of Israel, is calling what's happening in Gaza completely unacceptable, saying it must stop immediately. The EU and the UK talking about revisiting trade agreements with Israel, talking about sanctions and bans on Israeli ministers from traveling. I mean, this is very serious stuff. And the new German Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, saying, quote, a very long-standing ally of Israel, no longer understands Israel's objectives in Gaza. I mean, 600 days on, what has Israel achieved?
Well, Israel's objectives were very clear from the beginning. One is the return of the hostages, and the second is dismantling the genocidal jihadi terrorist group that lives on our borders and attacked us on October 7th. And in fact, those same people that have said that when they get the chance, when they regroup, they will attack again. This is the threat that Israel faces on our southern border. And so the objectives are very clear. Get rid of Hamas as the authority in the Gaza Strip and return our hostages. What the Chancellor doesn't understand about that, I'm not quite clear.
But couldn't it be argued that Israel is creating something of a long-term, an even greater long-term danger for itself as a result of, let's say, 3 more generations of hatred? And that's going to come from the killing and the maiming of 54,000 people. Okay, some of them were Hamas fighters, but many of them were not.
Half of them were Hamas fighters.
But we don't know that for sure.
And also in that number, if that number is true at all, it also includes people who died of natural deaths. Hamas puts everything in one bucket. So we have to be very careful from the genocidal terrorist groups numbers. But I don't accept this argument. I'll tell you why. Because the indoctrination which has been funded by all these countries that now condemn Israel through the UNRWA school system, that teaches the hatred of Jews, that teaches the fact that Jews are subhuman, that teaches children that the best thing they could do with their lives is sacrifice themselves for the cause. That is the reason why we have hatred. And it's not Israel defending itself in a war it didn't start. So all these countries that are condemning Israel today should look in the mirror and say, we've spent 50 years funding UNRWA, whose whole point was to perpetuate the refugee status of these people and to perpetuate the hatred of Israel and to try and reverse the 1948 declaration of the State of Israel.
Well, I was going to suggest we played a clip of Philippe Lazzarini next, because he's been one of the people who's been critical of this new Gaza humanitarian foundation.
It's a shame that Philippe Lazzarini doesn't look into the mirror himself and admits that he employed terrorists who took part in October 7th.
Let's take a listen to what he says about the GHF.
The model of aid distribution proposed by Israel does not align with core humanitarian principles. It will deprive large part of Gaza, the highly vulnerable people, of desperately needed assistance. We have seen yesterday the shocking images of hungry people pushing against fences, desperate for food, It was chaotic, undignified, and unsafe. I believe it is a waste of resources and a distraction from atrocities.
Okay, so Philippe Lazzarini there, critical of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, saying that aid should be distributed neutrally. I mean, some aid organizations have expressed grave discomfort as well with this, saying that it violates humanitarian principles. What are your thoughts?
Well, I would be happy to ask Mr. Lazzarini if he thinks employing terrorists and if he thinks that terrorists hiding tunnels under his own facilities, and if he thinks that the hatred that they've been teaching all these years is also in line with humanitarian doctrine, humanitarian aid doctrine. I don't think so. I think Mr. Lazzarini, before he opens his mouth, has to take a good look in the mirror.
Some of the hostages' families have been extremely vocal. Since we talked about hostages, let's bring them into the conversation. They say that, in fact, Israel's actions in Gaza are endangering the hostages. What do you say to them?
Look, I don't judge the parents or the family members of hostages. Of course, they're worried about their loved ones. It's been 600 days. So I'm not going to say whether they have a right to be concerned or not be concerned, because I'm in not the position that they are. But, you know, we still don't know whether military pressure is what actually gets Hamas to the deal. I believe it does. I believe that the last two deals that have been done to get the hostages out was as a result of military as well as diplomatic pressure that got Hamas to actually agree to the deal, or whether it endangers them. Like I said, I'm not them, I'm not in their position, and I'm certainly not going to judge their opinions on this.
In the context of considerable criticism, as we've been talking about from governments around the world, I mean, do you think Israel is considering something of a tactical shift in Gaza?
Again, the objectives were clear. I don't think any normal country, just pick any country, especially in the Middle East, with a border like the border that was broken through on October 7th, and with an enemy that keeps saying they're going to continue to kill you, I don't think any other country would have done anything different. And in fact, I think Israel has done pretty well in terms of its laws of wars and in terms of its humanitarian laws, the way that we've shifted population in order to avoid killing. And when you actually look at the net results, even if you take Hamas's numbers and you take out all the terrorists that were killed, which is 1-to-1, there is no other in the history of modern warfare, any other proportionally lower casualties that in this war. And the fact that it's been pushed out of proportion, and the fact that there's an obsession with reporting about this war instead of reporting about other tragedies going on, including starvation in places like Sudan, to me, simply attests to a double standard that only Israel has to face in the world.
Do you think the expulsion of Palestinians from Gaza is part of the Israeli government's plan?
Well, I don't think expulsion, but why is it the only war that people are not allowing refugees to leave? Why is the West intent on keeping the innocent people of Gaza in harm's way? When we had the Syrian civil war, in which Assad killed 500,000 people, never saw so many condemnations as we see right now of him. There's millions of Syrian refugees all across the world. Why is nobody putting any pressure on Egypt to open their borders and help out in this crisis, when they were really part of the problem, because a lot of the tunnels of the weapons that were smuggled into Gaza was coming in from Egypt. And so the fact that Egypt is not even in this conversation, the fact that Egypt could open its borders and relieve the humanitarian crisis, as well as relieve the refugee crisis for many innocent families, just tells you everything you need to know.
Well, I think the concern is that people, once they've left Gaza, won't be able to come back. I think.
Well, why not? Is anybody concerned about Syrians not coming home now that there's a new government?
Well, they are.
Well, then when there's a new government in Gaza, those people should be, in my opinion, allowed to come back.
Okay, well, we'll have to see what happens. I mean, what would a successful end to all of this look like? This is my last question. What do you think, as far as the Israeli government is concerned, what would a successful end to the situation in Gaza look like?
Well, you know, we're a country, as you know, of freedom of speech, and we're a country of fierce debate. And that's part and parcel of being a free and liberal democracy here in Israel. So many people have different opinions. I don't think the government of Israel has one scenario in their head, but in my mind, in my opinion, I think there has to be some type of a regional arrangement with the moderate Sunni Arab countries, with the Emirates and perhaps Saudi Arabia, the countries that understand full well what the Muslim Brotherhood is, how poisonous it can be, those countries to come in and try and take this wonderful strip of land and turn it into something wonderful for the people, for the Gazans that live there. Israel would love nothing more than peace with our neighbors. Every single country that has wanted peace with us, we have made peace with them. We would love to see a prosperous Gaza living side by side with a prosperous Israel.
So some sort of an Arab-led peacekeeping mission there in Gaza.
That would make sense to me. Whether the Arab countries that we think about are engaged in this type of thing or not, we have as yet to see. But I think that the Gazan people, if there was some type of regional leadership from Sunni moderate Arab countries, like I said, at the moment, the UAE, for example, is investing in Egypt's economy. They're going to build an island off the coast of Egypt. Well, why can't we do, by extension, something similar in Gaza, and to give these people a chance at a decent future for their children?
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Fleur Hassan-Nahoum, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Well, let's get more now. We can speak to Jonathan Fowler, who is a spokesperson for UNRWA, that is the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees. He joins us from Amman. Mr. Fowler, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. We've seen the images, people sleeping in tents, people eating once every few days, if at all. What's your understanding of what the reality of life in Gaza is right now?
The reality, it's very difficult to find words to describe it. I mean, you know, and this affects our colleagues on the ground, who are themselves part of the community. You know, their families, their communities around them, suffering. I mean, it's an unprecedented humanitarian crisis, basically. Everywhere you look, all the indicators are horrific. You know, the levels of malnutrition, the level of war trauma injuries, child amputees, orphan children, you know, families with a single survivor, entire families wiped out. I mean, I just keep going through the list. You know, the health impacts, the spread of disease, the fact that some people are still wearing the same clothes that they were wearing, you know, in October 2023, and all of these things. I mean, the sanitation situation, everything. I mean, it's a question of sort of almost plucking data, you know, sort of not out of the air as such, but, you know, every statistic I look at is increasingly horrific. It's that level of horror.
There's been a lot of focus in the last 24 hours on the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. It's not the traditional UN aid system by any means. A lot of aid agencies have expressed discomfort with the so-called GHF. What's your issue with it?
Well, I mean, I would draw your attention to something that was said by its CEO, who quit a couple of days ago. And he said that, you know, he was quitting over concerns about the impartiality, neutrality, independence, and the very humanity of the entire project. Now, that was something that we in the rest of the United Nations system had been saying from the very moment that this concept was first raised. Those concerns have not gone away. You know, I mean, international humanitarian law is very clear about how it is supposed to function, how aid operations are supposed to function. They're supposed to function in an impartial way, in the interest of the population that needs to receive the aid, people in desperate circumstances. This is something, you know, the rules are not unique to Gaza. These are things that the UN does around the world. We're not sort of, you know, stuck in the mud on principles, that kind of thing. The point is that these principles allow a practical level of operation, you know, unbiased humanitarian aid that doesn't involve a party to the conflict. And sadly, I mean, you know, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation has humanitarian in its name, but that does not make it compatible with humanitarian law. There is a system in place. There was a system in place. That system was able to function when it was allowed to function, able to scale up aid, bring it in massively during the ceasefire, do what was necessary to alleviate the impacts to a certain extent. And, it's like the wheel has been reinvented pointlessly. And this is like a solution in search of a problem, this GHF.
Yeah, I mean, we were speaking to someone who used to work for who works for the Israeli Foreign Ministry, a former deputy mayor of Jerusalem, who took aim at UNRWA and says she's got a real issue with your organization, and amongst other things, accuses UNRWA of political bias. I mean, it's nothing new, but what do you say to those kinds of accusations?
I mean, as you rightly say, this is nothing new. I mean, it's constantly retreaded. These accusations are baseless. They're made for completely different reasons, which are effectively to sort of, remove us from the picture. For I'm not inside the heads of people who want to remove us from the picture, but the sense from analysts is that we are seen as a stumbling block to some kind of unilateral solution to the Palestine refugee situation. But the reason we're still here doing our job of work as mandated by the UN General Assembly for the past 75 years is there has not been a just and lasting solution to the issue of Palestine refugees. There's no question about that. So anybody who says, we're biased, we're not biased. We're an independent, neutral UN organization. We take such claims seriously. When endless claims have been made by the Israeli authorities about our organization, yesterday our Commissioner General, the head of UNRWA, Philip Lazzarini, made public extracts of a letter that he has sent to the Israeli Foreign Ministry, basically saying, you endlessly make allegations. We repeatedly ask for assistance in substantiating these allegations. We will take action. But we never get a response. That's how it stands, basically. So, whatever, former politicians from within the Israeli establishment may like to say, or even current politicians, those arguments are entirely spurious. We also hear, I mean, on the issue of humanitarian aid, we've heard constant accusations that somehow, militant groups, Hamas and others, are getting the bulk of the aid. I mean, that is, I have to say, to be quite blunt, complete rubbish. We are constantly hearing this, and yet, there have been members of the former US administration who've come out recently saying that they never even received any information at a private level from the Israeli authorities to back up these accusations that are made in public. This is why I said earlier, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation is a solution in search of a problem. It's spurious accusations.
Yeah, what the Israelis say is that they want to distribute food, but to be sure that it doesn't go to people who are linked to Hamas. That's their argument. That doesn't stack up, does it, when it comes to humanitarian law?
It absolutely does not stack up. And I just want to emphasize something, which is, the way United Nations aid operations work and the way our agency works in the Gaza Strip is that we work without any intermediaries. So we know when we've been able to get aid in the past, we have known, that aid will come in, it will go to our warehouses all along the chain, right through to the hands of the person receiving the aid. We know, it's tracked. We even have, identity controls on the individuals getting the aid. Our understanding is that the current system, which is in place, doesn't even do those kind of ID checks. So, supposedly a solution to a problem which is an inexistent problem, but is actually perhaps making a problem itself. Again, accusations, baseless accusations, in an attempt to do something else.
One of the new developments we're following is there are reportedly 6 people who've been shot and killed by Israeli forces trying to reach an aid distribution point in Rafah, which is, of course, in the south of Gaza. I don't know if you have any details on that, but what does it say to us that people who are trying to get their hands on food aid are being shot at and killed? I mean, what can we read into that?
Well, I'm aware of these reports, of course. We don't have any presence there, so it's impossible for me to confirm any kind of details. But I mean, what I can say is that our operations, the United Nations aid operations, as I explained, function according to a system, you know, a well-honed, well-practiced system which functions around the world, and it's about distribution of aid to people in need. This system where people are required to come into effectively an obliterated zone to then, you know, stand in lines to pick up aid, and you know, it's not done in a sort of basis of family size. I mean, this is our understanding, you know, that it's basically whoever's there gets given it. Well, you know, if you're a family which is lucky enough to have, you know, 4 or 5 surviving young male relatives, that means you're more likely to be able to get the aid in this current system, as opposed to what happens to the amputee or the, you know, the widow with children, people who are far from these zones where they're supposed to come. I mean, you know, we, other UN agencies have raised the specter of aid being used as bait. And that is quite shocking because that flies in the face of international humanitarian law. But there's also a basic principle of humanity here, which is that our system enables people who are in need to receive what they need, or at least, you know, a step towards what they need, and nothing is being done in this case. So when we hear reports of violence, you know, I mean, these kind of things, again, it illustrates the fact that this project is basically flawed.
Just in terms of definitions, I just want to ask you about your understanding of the situation with regards to the food situation in Gaza. We're being told that famine is imminent by some saying famine has already started. 500,000 people face starvation. Just talk us through the definitions. Are we at the point where we can say there is a famine in Gaza?
I mean, sadly, famine, you know, I mean, in common parlance, yes, you know, it's a label used to describe a hunger crisis, but in technical terms, it's an analysis of certain criteria, and then the label famine can be applied. But the problem is when those criteria have been met, that means the famine has already started. And we've seen in the past, for example, you know, in cases like Somalia, you know, sort of 30-something years ago, where the declaration of famine came, you know, months after tens of thousands of people had already died. Now, you know, we see pockets of famine-like condition across the Gaza Strip. The issue is, when do those pockets start to, you know, coagulate? Where do we see more and more of this? We see increasing numbers of patients with severe malnutrition. I mean, this is an easy thing to assess, particularly in young children. You just measure the circumference of their arm, you know, with a special tape measure. And basically, if the tape measure goes into the red zone when you pull it, you know that the child's arm is too small for their age. We're seeing cases of stunting amongst children across the Gaza Strip. So, you know, the here and now, people need to get food. People need to get, you know, the kind of food that can alleviate these impacts, or indeed the medication, and they're not able to get any of that. But we're also talking about the future, because for children, you know, we're in a situation where cognitive and physical development can be affected for years, with societal impacts, you know, for decades to come. But yes, I mean, you know, there is not enough food in the Gaza Strip. The amount of aid that has, I mean, no aid was allowed to come in because of a complete siege imposed by the Israeli authorities since the beginning of March. You know, that siege was likely lifted last week. A little bit of aid came in. But we need basically about 600 trucks of supplies per day to meet the minimum standards, the minimum level, the minimum survival needs, basically, of the population. And it's not just about getting food now, you know, because people have basically been very, very physically damaged. Their health has been damaged by not having enough to eat over months. They've been rationing what they had, and eventually that didn't even work. We've heard, you know, horror stories where, you know, an anecdote from a mother, from one of our colleagues told us about, which was, you know, she took the bread and she said, I break the bread in half, I give half to my children, I save the rest for tomorrow. You know, that's stark.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking. And I just want to ask you, Jonathan, because we're nearly out of time, but I just want to ask, from your own experience, are there any parallels you can draw with anything you've ever seen anywhere else in the world?
I mean, I've worked in a number of different zones, you know, in my UN career and before. I've never seen aid weaponized to this extent. The denial of aid as a weapon of war. You know, and that's not me alone saying and seeing that. I mean, colleagues who have even greater experience in humanitarian situations than I do. This this is unprecedented. I cannot think of a similar precedent for the duration. The impact, certainly not in the existence of the United Nations.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Jonathan Fowler, UNRWA spokesperson, thank you for your time.
Thanks a lot.
Well, let's bring into the conversation now Jasmine El-Gamal, who is the former advisor at the US Pentagon and a Middle East analyst. Thank you very much indeed for joining us from London, Jasmine. We're 600 days into this conflict in Gaza. I mean, what does the Israeli strategy appear to be, and do you think it's sustainable?
Thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, Tom. I think there's a difference here between what the Israeli government and Netanyahu in particular thinks and says his strategy is versus what others, including former Israeli officials, are saying the strategy is. Those are two different things. Benjamin Netanyahu, 600 days into a war that is now widely being called a genocide, even in the most mainstream of newspapers and by the most mainstream of pundits. 600 days into this, Benjamin Netanyahu still insists that he has a strategy, that the strategy is to eliminate Hamas and to get the hostages back. But if you look at what other people are saying, Netanyahu's critics, his former defense minister, former Israeli prime ministers, former intelligence officials, they all are saying the same thing, which is that there is no strategy here. There is no end game. The fight against Hamas in response to October 7th was finished months and months ago. There has been no way for Hamas to reconstitute physically and attack Israel again in an October 7th style attack. That has not been possible for months. And President Joe Biden, when he was president back, I think this was around April of last year, said from the podium at the White House that Hamas had been effectively dismantled and defeated. So this idea that this war is still continuing or this genocide is still continuing because Hamas has not yet been defeated has been really proven to be an outright lie. When it comes to the hostages and the return of the hostages, we've seen over the last 2 years, almost 2 years now, that the way to get the most hostages back home safely is through a ceasefire and negotiations. That's been the way to get the most number of hostages released. And so the fact that Netanyahu has refused time and time again to adhere to ceasefire roadmaps and plans and reneges on Israeli commitment to that ceasefire really also tells us that the return of the hostages is not actually a priority of him or his government.
Okay, and Jasmine, one development today, since we're talking about, this milestone day, 600 days in, talking about strategy, talking about what Israel's actually achieved. I mean, the Israeli Prime Minister could argue today he's achieved something because it was announced by him that Mohammed, who was the Hamas chief in Gaza, has been, quote, eliminated. That's coming from Israel. Is that significant? And if so, why?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because I think that, of course, it's significant, right? I mean, Mohammed, the brother of Yahya Sinwar, the mastermind of October 7th, someone who was very involved in military planning. Obviously, that's going to be extremely significant for Israelis to see that the person who was involved in planning this horrific attack has finally been killed. But I think this speaks to the larger issue of strategy and of the human cost of that one death. Right? So when it comes to leadership of Hamas or leadership of any terrorist organization, it has been proven time and time again that when you don't address the root causes of a conflict and you just focus on eliminating the top layers of leadership or even the mid-level leadership, that the organization will continue to reconstitute because there's always going to be a reason for it and a cause for it to recruit people into. So the short answer is yes, of course it's significant. The longer answer is the human cost in terms of Palestinians killed, infrastructure, hospitals, schools, refugee camps, all of these things has been way too high. And in the end, killing the leadership of Hamas without addressing the root causes of why Hamas exists in the first place is not an effective strategy moving forward. They are simply, like any other organization, will continue to recruit, to have more leaders, and we're going to be stuck in this endless cycle of violence for the foreseeable future.
Right, and we've been speaking to an aid organization on the ground in Gaza that says that the situation is going to have consequences and a knock-on effect for many years to come, even after peace is found. I want to ask you about what sounds like a growing chorus of condemnation of Israel's actions coming from traditional key allies. We're talking about countries like Germany, Italy, the United Kingdom, that Israel would ordinarily count as its friends. We also kind of are getting the impression the United States is starting to lose patience with at least the Israeli leadership. Is that your sense as well?
Yeah, I think it's really important to, while we should recognize and appreciate that this growing chorus of criticism and harsher words against Israel are really starting to resonate, even amongst Israel's closest allies, we have to come back and look at what is actually happening on the ground, Tom. What actual changes, what actual pressure is being placed on Benjamin Netanyahu in order to get him to change his behavior? Now, let's take the U.S. as a start. The U.S. is obviously the biggest weapons supplier and the biggest supporter of Israel. We've been hearing that the U.S. has been losing patience with Benjamin Netanyahu for about a year and a half now, starting with President Biden and now with President Trump as well. Now, President Trump has made some moves that President Biden didn't and probably never would have. He went to the Middle East and skipped Israel on the trip. He has been negotiating with the Iranians, with Hamas, without telling the Israelis first. Those are very bold steps, and they do signal not only displeasure with Israel, but the fact that President Trump is looking at what American interests are and starting to decouple those from Israeli interests, which is quite unprecedented when it comes to U.S. foreign policy. When it comes to other countries, you mentioned Germany. Germany is one of the 3 biggest arms suppliers to Israel, along with the U.S. and Italy. The German chancellor said, and I'm reading this now, he said he no longer understands Israel's objectives in Gaza and that the suffering of civilians could no longer be justified by a fight against Hamas terror. But at the very same time that he said that, the German foreign minister said, because of our history, we just have to assist Israel. Germany always has to assist Israel. Same thing with Italy, harsh words, nothing about the weapons supplies to Israel. Same thing with other European countries. So yes, same thing with the UK, where I am now. David Lammy announced the suspension of talks on trade between Israel and the UK. A couple of days later, the trade minister was in Israel. So you really have to ask at this point, Tom, are words actually enough? Are they going to stop at words? Or are they actually going to take action? Because right now, words have not shown to be effective at all.
Okay, and you make a great point there. A tougher tone on Israel, and it's coming from the European Union as well. But the question remains, will it actually make a difference? But my question is this. I mean, we've seen some huge protests around the world. For example, the protest in Paris that I saw at the weekend, huge numbers of people out on the streets. I'm just wondering whether the crisis that we're in right now, where Gaza is on the brink of famine, or is in a state of famine, as some say it already is, could this be a tipping point, do you think, where governments say, right, enough is enough, and could that result to more governments coming under pressure from their populations to recognize statehood for the Palestinian people?
I would hope so. I mean, here in the UK as well, we've seen protests every Saturday since nearly the beginning of the Israeli campaign in Gaza. So I think the pressure is there. I think poll after poll show us in the UK, in the US. I haven't checked France, but the daylight between the public and the politicians is growing larger and larger. More and more polls are showing us that more and more people are against this war and that they want their countries to stop supporting Israel in the way that it's conducting this war. Again, nearly every mainstream outlet is now using the word genocide, and some European officials as well in Parliament, Spain and Slovenia. I think the real pressure, though, the real change will come And of course, I mean, we don't have this kind of time, right? Palestinians don't have this kind of time. But I think the language of politicians is votes, is elections. And I think unless you really start to see a sort of wider scale shift in the way people vote based on this, that you can see a scenario where a lot of politicians say, you know, this is noise, it's annoying, but it doesn't really change the bottom line for us. So we don't have to pay much attention to it.
I want to ask you about the GHF, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. We've seen some fairly chaotic images of aid being distributed in Gaza in the last 24 hours. I just want to ask you for your thoughts on this foundation, what its purpose is, because some people are saying its aim is to undermine UN influence in Gaza. What are your thoughts?
Oh, I absolutely agree with that. I mean, the UN and every single humanitarian organization, and I've spoken to people from those organizations at length about this. From the very beginning, when this Gaza Humanitarian Foundation was announced and their plan for how to distribute aid was going to be announced, everyone in the humanitarian field came out against this strongly. They said that, you know, for a couple of reasons. One is it entirely bypasses and flies in the face of humanitarian principles, which are to provide aid and food and assistance to the people who need it. This doesn't do that. What it does is it sets up, I think right now the number is 4, they want to move to 8, distribution points where people have to travel, often for a very long distance from where they are, in a war zone. Remember, there's no ceasefire right now. So they have to travel, they have to leave their families, they have to walk on foot in very dangerous conditions. So they have to be able-bodied and they have to be willing to take the risk, right? To go to these distribution zones, be crammed into these, you know, cage-like structures, these wires that we saw in those pictures yesterday, and wait to have that aid handed to them. And of course, we saw yesterday the scenes were incredibly chaotic. I mean, you saw people being fired at, you saw people screaming, people being injured. We've had at least one confirmed report of a man having gone missing, that he was basically taken by the IDF or by intelligence officials. It's not quite clear yet. On the Israeli side for interrogation, his family doesn't know where he is now. So a lot of people are saying, look, we told you this was going to happen from the beginning. This is not only dangerous, not only is the aid not reaching the people who need it, but this is also seemingly being used for really nefarious purposes, such as luring people away from their homes, separating families, interrogating people, and then potentially also disappearing them.
Would you say the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation is there to stay?
I don't see how this kind of chaos continues. I mean, you saw yesterday that the Americans who are supposed to be giving out this aid, they started retreating after they saw the huge number of people rushing to get the aid. You have to remember, these are people who haven't had any food or assistance come into Gaza since March 2nd. And so to think that you're going to have the smooth, orderly process where you get people to come and stand in line patiently for these meager boxes of food. By the way, the head of Refugees International yesterday posted on social media the contents of those boxes include dried pasta and raw flour, which people can't even make any use of because Israel, to this day, at this point, still isn't allowing water, fresh water sources and fuel into Gaza. So how are they supposed to turn that raw flour and pasta into actual food? So the whole thing is just a complete abdication of responsibility, I think, on the part of the international community to actually compel Israel to allow the UN and other humanitarian organizations who already have this proven system of providing assistance in conflict zones to just let them do their job. Instead of pressuring Israel, they're choosing to support this and saying, well, it's not perfect, but some amount of aid is better than no amount of aid at all. And I think it's just really horrific for the population there.
I mean, Israelis that we speak to tell this channel that, you know, the alternative is that food, humanitarian aid ends up in the hands of Hamas and then gets weaponized by that group. I mean, how do you respond to that?
I think in any conflict zone, anybody who's ever been to a conflict zone or worked in a conflict zone knows that when you're in a conflict and there is a situation where humanitarian assistance is being doled out, that there's always going to be a chance that bad actors, and not just Hamas, I mean, looters, gangs are going to try to get their hands on some of that aid. The question is that a reason to starve the entire population?
In terms of allowing this conflict to carry on, I mean, what would you say are the risks to regional stability? Because obviously we've already seen the consequences of what happened on October the 7th play out in Lebanon. But could we see spillover? Could we see risks emerging in other countries in the region as a result of what's happening in Gaza?
I mean, one would have to imagine that this is going to have incredible ripple effects across the entire region. I mean, go back to the US invasion of Iraq. I think about that a lot these days because a lot of the problems, whether it's with terrorism, with ISIS, extremism, the refugee crisis in Syria that impacted as far away as Europe, all of those issues stemmed out of the seeds that were planted in that conflict. And so in a conflict like this, where you've literally, starved an entire population, you have injected a level of violence and brutality. And of course, this is not, I mean, we have to also recognize that Hamas, initiated this round of the conflict between Israel with Israel on October 7th, but this has far, the Israeli response has far transcended just a response to October 7th. But I'm talking about that dynamic where you have non-state actors, where you have a country that is behaving extremely aggressively across the entire region. We've seen Israel go into Lebanon. We've seen them go into Syria. We've seen them strike the Houthis. We've seen them agitate against Iran. I mean, there are so many different fires that are sort of, at different times, really burning across the region. One has to imagine that if this issue is not resolved, and again, I mention, and this is not an academic term, but the root causes of these conflicts, the occupation, this idea that Palestinians cannot have their own state and always have to be in a state of resisting an occupation. These are all things that unless they are addressed, the conflict between Israel and Iran and how that has to be solved diplomatically, right? We are going to continue, I think, to see ripple effects. I was talking to some Arab diplomats, Egyptian specifically, and Jordanian, and they are extremely worried about the impact this war in Gaza is going to have on their borders. They're afraid that Palestinians are going to be shoved into Egypt and Jordan and create a crisis they can't get their hands on, that they're going to be forced into participating in an ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, let alone the economic and security impacts of that. So yes, people are extremely worried throughout the region. And I think everyone, you saw this with Trump's trip to the Gulf, everyone is on the same page, except for Israel, that people need to get and, sit around the table and find diplomatic solutions to these problems, Tom.
Okay, and just to wrap up, while we're talking about sort of solutions, a viable exit strategy for Gaza seen by the Israelis. I mean, do you think Arab nations, and I put this question earlier to our Israeli guests, do you think Arab nations have a role to play with perhaps some form of an Arab-led peacekeeping force that could be deployed to Gaza?
Well, the Arabs have put together this plan, right, for Gaza. They got together in Cairo earlier this year, and they talked about a plan for reconstructing Gaza, for governance. They've talked about setting up and supporting a committee of technocrats that does not include Hamas to govern Gaza the day after. They've talked about putting money towards reconstruction efforts, and there is a willingness to engage in talks about contributing to a peacekeeping force. But unless the war is over, unless hostilities stop, unless Benjamin Netanyahu commits to a permanent end in hostilities, And unless Hamas commits to the same, you can really see why Arab states would be nervous about sending troops and other resources into Gaza, because they don't want to be caught in that conflict. So I think really the focus now is on a ceasefire, ending the conflict, so then they can start talking about what to do next.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time. Thank you very much indeed. Always a pleasure talking to you, Jasmine El-Gamal. Thank you very much indeed for your time today.
Always a pleasure. Thank you so much.
So there we have it. We've had a full set of views in this edition of Global News today. We've had the Israeli perspective. We've had the situation on the ground. We've got the broader aid dimension as well there from the UNRWA spokesperson. And then we wrapped up, of course, with a view on the geopolitical situation and the possibility of broader regional implications from this ongoing conflict in Gaza. That brings us to the end of this edition of Global News today. Thanks for watching. See you tomorrow.